All right, let's do it. More folks are coming in, but good afternoon. I'm Kenrick Duru, one of the co-PIs of the UCLA Rick Marchime, and excited that you're joining us today to hear from one of our core faculty, Gary Ryan, who will be speaking on qualitative data collection. He's trained as a medical anthropologist and has many interesting studies on HIV and diarrhea in third world settings, has worked on this kind of in different countries. It was at Rand and is now at Kaiser, as you can see here. And I'll pass it to Gary to go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right. Thanks, Kenrick. All right. So I'm going to blame you, Kenrick, because you sort of voluntold me that we needed to do this, and it's an impossible task. So, in less than an hour, we need to cover qualitative data collection writ large. And so the first thing I figured I needed to do is change the title. So what I want to do is talk about the exploratory data collection. And we're going to sort of we will get to the point where we're going to talk about data collection techniques, but I want to put this in context so that then when you start to think about how do you make the trade-offs with one technique or another, you have some sort of basis from which to jump from. So we're going to talk about what do we mean by, we're going to a little sort of linguistics of methodology here. Then I want to talk about how does exploratory data collection fit into the larger research enterprise context. Then we'll talk about pros and cons of different techniques. And eventually, I want to sort of bring us back to and ask the question, so what are the basics of sort of an exploratory approach to research? Sort of putting in a bigger context as opposed to just these techniques. So what do we mean by qualitative data collection? Now, I'm going to draw you back into what I learned in middle school, which was grammar. And qualitative is an adjective, and it defines nouns. The question is, A, what do we mean by qualitative? And eventually we're going to ask, what does it modify? So let's ask the question, what do we mean by qualitative? What is qualitative as opposed to quantitative? What I often hear when I ask this question is we talk about numbers and words. And I'm going to argue that that's not really actually precise, because zip codes are actually, even though they're numbers, they're qualitative concepts. And if I ask you to, somebody responds 3, the word 3 can actually be both qualitative or quantitative depending on the context. So it's actually easier to define qualitative by first defining what we mean by quantitative. And in quantitative, what implies, the adjective implies quantity. In implying quantity, it assumes 2 fundamental things. First of all, it assumes that we are talking about a unidimensional continuum, and that the continuum is at least ordinal in its framing, right? So the notion that, none, a little, a lot, those are actually quantitative concepts. You can apply them to anything. That is literally an ordinal scale. All right. So if we take quantitative and we sort of know what quantitative is, then it turns out that qualitative is sort of the absence of quantity. And when you take away quantity, what you have left is quality, or the quality or characteristic of some thing. All right. So when we do surveys, even though we might code it 0 and 1 or A, B, and C, or 1, 2, and 3, doesn't matter. Gender, ethnicity are simply categories. They're qualitative or nominal categories. And the second thing I want to point out is everything that we study from the very beginning is by definition qualitative. The phenomena of interest is qualitative, and the quantitative components of it are just simply subcomponents or subparts. So if we define qual and quant this way, then the question applies to what does qualitative modify, data or collection? And I'm actually going to say you can modify data, or you can modify this compound noun data collection as an activity. So throughout, what you're going to see is at the end of the day, I think we got to be very careful in applying qualitative, the adjective, to data. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to apply qualitative to the activity of data collection, because data collection can be both. And unless you want to say, I'm only collecting for qualitative data, which none of our instruments actually do. They are always getting qual and quant in both of them. So it doesn't make any sense. What I'm going to suggest instead is we use exploratory and confirmatory for our activities and qual and quant only for data. So let's see how this plays out in a minute here. So how does this data collection stuff fit into the larger enterprise? Well, we all know what the enterprise looks like. So let's just go through the steps so we're all on the same page. You got to start off with, what are you interested in? You're going to ask, and you're going to iterate around and around and around this thing. Anybody that's written a proposal know we spend hours and days looking at, what do you want to address? What study questions? What are your aims? What is most important? Where's the significance? Why is this innovative? And around you go. And along the way, as somebody who mentors PhD students, the PhD students will come in and I will constantly remind them, what have you seen in the literature? And go back to that. Right? Eventually, once you figure out what you want to do and where you want to go, then, this is the scoping, you jump into, well, where am I going to get this information from? Now, typically, this is what we refer to as sampling. But I'm going to just say, let's just call it basically, where does the information come from? Human beings or data sets, right? Then within that, then I can ask how I'm going to collect data from these sources. And this is the data collection step itself. Eventually, we collect our data. We got to store it. We got to manage it and so forth. This is a step we often sort of forget about, but it's clearly a step in the process. Once we manage the data, we're going to do some sort of analysis, right? And we're going to figure out, and the analysis is basically designed to identify patterns, and it's for pattern recognition. Our analysis, however, does not tell us anything about how to interpret the results. So once you get to your results section, that, your p-values, your effect sizes, your multiple regression analysis, it doesn't matter. You're still going to have to put your results back into context, which is essentially an interpretation. And what we often forget in research is there's this whole other part is it doesn't end there. You have to basically, who is going to see the results and how are they going to be used? And this is all about communication, dissemination, right? So what we have is, what is the thing you're studying? What do you want to understand? How will you get information? How will you find pattern? And how will you communicate your results and your implications, right? So if you look at this, data collection is one tiny step, an important step, mind you, but one step in many. If you're going to treat this as a process, then paying attention to the front end of the process and the back end of the process actually will help define what you really want from your data collection. And we're going to see this play out over and over again. We have a tendency to think that research is sort of like, Legos or Tinker Toys or Lincoln Logs, all these little parts, right? And our job is to put all the parts together and make something. But most of the time we tend to start by looking at the cover of the box to look for the figure and figure out where we want to go, and then we get there. So in some ways, methods is like that. Our techniques, we have a huge variety of techniques. But what I hear most often when people come and ask methodological questions, and they want to know which is the best thing to do. And frankly, like Legos or Tinker Toys or an erector set, there is no best. It depends on what you want to do. And the best is not which technique, but which combination of techniques, sampling, data collection, analysis techniques, are going to get you to that end stage of how are you planning to use this? Will this be sufficient? Right? So if scoping really is about those early steps, defining what you're looking at and describing what you hope to accomplish, then you kind of argue that there's only two types of studies. Or let's do the process first. You start off with, what do we currently understand? This is sort of an intellectual journey. You're starting on the West Coast. You ask, what do I want to understand? And then you ask the question, how will this new understanding be used and by whom? Right? So the far right-hand side is actually our research aims and objectives. This is where we want to go. This is the destination. All right? The reason it's important to figure this out is that it defines who is going to use this and how they're going to use it, defines the level of breadth, precision, confidence, and generalizability that we need for our research. Right? The challenge we have in academics, or in much of what most of the folks on this call are, not pure academics, you're applied academics. You want to understand how stuff works, and we want to basically make a difference in the world. All right. Those two things are often in conflict because we have two different audiences. We have one audience that's academic, and we have another audience that's going to use our research to actually make decisions, often our community partners, policymakers, et cetera, the people we want to influence. And they have completely different standards of what they see as being important from the same research. Our academic colleagues tend to be a lot more persnickety. They want a lot of details. They want super confidence. They're terrified of being wrong. And many of our community partners are going, I have a million things that are going on. Your input into this decision-making through your research is one tiny little piece. So I may not need, as a community partner, the tons of details your academic partners actually want from you. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the back end of where I want to get to and how the research is going to be used. Then, once you have that, then you can start figuring out what are my research questions that are going to get me there. We tend to refer to this whole thing as research design. All right. Now, what I see typically is we do a forward design where we start off with what do we currently know, we do the literature research, and we work down through, and often at the very end, we try to figure out what our research aims and objectives are. But what I would argue is if you want to be efficient, you actually want to do backwards design, where you start off with going, what do I want to get to? And then ask the question, how am I going to get there? All right. So another way of thinking about this is I want to learn about this. That's my questions to affect that, which is my aims. All right. So as I said, if you look at the back end of aims and sort of this whole process is really probably two fundamental types of studies. One type is exploratory. All right. And exploratory, what you're really doing is you're going from knowing a little to knowing more. You're really trying to go from sort of being ignorant to at least having some hunches or working hypotheses. You know that the sort of litmus test for you're doing exploratory research is if you can phrase it like this: I want to understand, and then fill in any of the 6 following words: how, when, where, why, what, where, who. All right. So if you want to understand, then you're almost always doing exploratory. Now, the opposite is confirmatory. If you're doing confirmatory research, you're essentially saying, I want to know if X causes Y, or X worked, or X is bigger than Y, or I want to know how much, how many, how often. I want one answer. It's either yes or no, which is the top one. You're testing a hypothesis. You're going to answer yes or no, or I need to know a very specific number with an error bar around it. That's the how much, how many, how often. Right? So the left-hand side of exploratory is really broad and general, and the right-hand side is super narrow and precise. On the confirmatory studies, you're always testing a hypothesis, and you're spending inordinate amounts of time to make sure everybody agrees about the rules of the the research game are. You lay out, this is what I'm going to take. Here's my power calculation. Here's the types of error I'm willing to accept. We lay all that out, the rules of the game, and we get a thumbs up or a thumbs down at the end of the day. So we spend massive amounts of resources for a tiny, tiny little one question because we think that question is important, right? Totally fine. Now, oftentimes those research questions, so if I do I do a experimental design, I test a new intervention in a medical setting, and lo and behold, I do it super rigorously, and I come back and I say to whoever funded me, yes, the intervention worked, thumbs up. Almost immediately the question back is, thank you very much, but which components really had the biggest effect? Or can you do this cheaper? Or who does it affect or not? There's a million other questions that come after it. And that should either sends you back into, I need to test another hypothesis, or I need to go explore. Now, where you start and where you end are totally independent of each other. You can go around in this sort of figure eight in any which way, in any combination you want, right? So the problem is adjectives. We talk about the left-hand side. The code word for this type of study is often a qualitative study. I've heard people have been asked to, can you explain what a qualitative research design is? And the upper confirmatory, the code word for that is quantitative. And it's sort of the wrong way to think. And you're going to get confused, and it's not going to be very helpful. So let's go to exploratory. So if in fact you are exploring, there's basically 4 types of exploration you can do, and they usually all come together, but they start off with, if you're really naive and you don't know anything, the first thing you want to do is discover. And discover means when you find something you didn't know was there. So you're trying to identify stuff in relationships between stuff that you hadn't thought about. So it's not there. It's not in the literature, just not there. The second thing you want to do is you want to describe. And here you're describing a phenomenon. It might be an experience, it might be a process, it might be a decision-making set of choices, it might be a set of relationships, it might be a whole community, it might be a clinic, a thing. And so when you describe it, the first thing you're doing in exploratory mode is you're describing what the range is. Then you're trying to describe what is common, what is typical, what is average, what is modal. Think of this as core and periphery, right? And then you're trying to describe that variation around what is common. Now, I can do this with numbers, or I can do it with words, right? Think about how a novelist literally describes a character in a novel. When they write, they are doing all of this. They're telling you about the range of this character's activities, their emotions, their thoughts. They're telling you, you start to get a sense of what is core to them, and you understand that person enough so you can anticipate what they're going to do because there's certain things about them that make them them, right? And then all of a sudden you're surprised when they do something sort of out of character. That's your variation. So we know we can do this with words. So after description, we may want to do comparisons. And again, we can do this by looking at similarities between group A and group B. We can talk about similarities in range, similarities in distribution. And again, this can be done with words as well as numbers. And finally, we want to explain. We want to explain how one thing is related to other things. And this can be causal or non-causal. Explaining how something works is not a causal explanation. It's an explanation of functions, roles, right? So if you're shooting for explanation, almost inevitably, this is sort of like a Gutman scale, you also are going to probably participate in discovery, description, and comparison along the way, right? But the challenge now is, how do you actually get these things done efficiently and effectively? All right. So the other thing about exploratory sort of studies is there's certain types of questions that fit into them more than others. So let's look at a sort of range of research questions. I'm going to look at research questions along two continuums. One is from broad to narrow, and the other is from description to causal. All right. So let me give you some examples. So a really broad descriptive is, how does X work? A broad causal is, why did X happen? Tell me the history. Okay. Somewhere in the middle are the what, the W questions. What, where, when, and who is doing something, or why does X occur? These are simpler, narrower answers than we get on the left. And then on the far right, we've already started talking about this. Is X, or does X, fill in the blank? Or how much, how many, how often? Or does X cause Y as the causal, right? So on the left-hand side, you have exploratory. On the right-hand side, you have confirmatory. No one side is better than the other. They're just different, right? So here's our exploratory box that we're trying to get through. And again, how are we going to get there? So now let's talk. Now you sort of got where we want to go. How are you going to actually collect this data? So first question you have to ask is, where did data come from? Where's the magical source of data? Well, there's only three places they come from. They come from indirect observations, direct observations, or elicitation, or some combination of all of these three. So think about it. Indirect observation, sometimes referred to as secondary data, is everything that is collected, that there is an archive of, that is sitting there, collected for some reason, and you now can use that set of information for your own, answering your own particular data research question. Okay. So sometimes we have data sets. Sometimes we have data sets that are intentionally built for research. Most of our data sets are not, right? Archaeology, the whole field of archaeology is dependent upon indirect observations. We dig stuff up, right? Now, direct observations, okay, I observe. As the researcher, I observe. Now, how I observe, what I observe, when I observe, how long I observe, that's all in my control. But it's all based on observation through basically my eyeballs. The elicitation technique is different. Elicitation is, I am actually going to talk to folk and ask them questions. Now, under elicitation, we have unstructured, semi-structured, structured, and mixed, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Under structured, we have questionnaires that use basically open-ended questions, and surveys, which use primarily closed-ended questions. And this mixed technique, we have all these fancy code words for, right? And mixed techniques means you take all of the three. We have some indirect, a little direct observation, some elicitation, and we might call it ethnography. We might call it participant observation. We might call it case studies or site visits. Those are all basically, you're showing up, you're getting to talk to folks, you get to see a bunch of stuff, you get to collect stuff, right? The only difference on participant observation is you're actually engaged in an activity as a participant in the activity, not just an outside observer, right? Make sense? So notice from the left to the right, there's this continuum of researcher control. You always have control over what you decide to study. You always have control over what you decide to count as your data. But in the indirect case, you have no control over how it was collected or why it was collected or what is actually there. That was in the control of somebody else who did the collecting for you a priori, right? On direct observation, you have control, again, about what you look at, how long, how often, all of that stuff, but you can only see the external components of it. You cannot see inside people's heads. You cannot see back into history. You cannot see a lot of things. Elicitation, however, is all encompassing. Elicitation is like the powerful concept because not only can you observe and watch, but elicitation, when you're asking people questions, you can get them to tell you what's going on in their inside of them, what they felt, what they thought, everything you can't see. More importantly, you can actually use their eyeballs and their experiences, and they will tell you about them for things that are not necessarily inside of them. They can tell you about what happened in that accident. This is how we have juries. And right, they can tell you about what it was like to observe something. They can tell you about how things worked. So essentially what we're using is both getting elicitation is not only to get the internal story, but to use people's eyeballs to go into places that we would never, ever be able to, often never get to, never be able to experience, etc. So you got a lot more control. Now I have two other questions for you on this figure. Where did qualitative data come from? And where did quantitative data come from on this diagram? And yes, it is likely if I do an interview with somebody, I will get a lot of qualitative data, a lot of stories, but I get my quantitative data and my qualitative data from all the same sources. These all generate qual and quant. So the notion that our data collection tools are one side or the other is actually wrong, right? And it's in the most gentle way possible, it is not helpful. I actually tend to think that it's been used for a long time as a denigration technique, for used by people to denigrate other types of research that they are not doing as a way to accumulate more of their resources. But separating off qual and quant as for how we collect it is not very helpful. So we're going to keep coming back to this linguistic problem here. So adjectives really, really do matter, and they're really different from how you apply them to interviews and questions. So on interviews, we have unstructured, semi-structured, and structured, or some combination of mixed, or we have standardized and non-standardized. And in standardized, what we really are talking about, all respondents get exactly the same questions, and all respondents get the same questions in the same order. All right? And again, we're going to talk more about the unstructured, semi-structured in a minute. The other piece, adjectives that we don't use a lot of, but that are really important, is the mode in which we are eliciting. All right, we can do face-to-face, we can do by phone, we can do by mail, we can do web-based, and we can now do this, the new thing we've had for a while, but it has come into the fore, is we can do virtual interviews. And they all have advantages and disadvantages, right? So there's a notion that face-to-face is always better. I'll tell you, point out always that, and as soon as you hear always, you know it's wrong, right? Face-to-face may be useful in times, but it's super expensive. It often is extremely biased because the people you can meet face-to-face are a subsample of all the people you could possibly meet because of their schedules and everything else, all the constraints on your respondents. Phone interviews are actually really good. Those were my preferred, my preference is to do phone interviews. I actually find sometimes that the distance and not being face-to-face is actually useful for having conversations about sensitive issues. Now, you got to have a good phone voice, and you got to be comfortable imagining the person on the other end of the phone of what they're doing. And yes, you can't see their facial expressions, but I can glean a ton of information from tone and cadence. Anybody knows this is true. If you have a significant other or somebody you're really close to, when they call you and you pick up that phone, you can tell their mood within 2 words. right? And so phone is useful there. The advantage of phone over mail is phone, you actually control the sequence in which the questions are asked. Face to face, you control the sequence. In mail, you don't. When you mail somebody a questionnaire or a survey, they can jump back and forth. They can start at the end, they start at the beginning. They can go back and change answers based on their previous answers. And so you lose control on mail. Web-based, you have a little more control. It's still written, but you have more control. You can prevent people from going forward or force them to sort of force choice, et cetera, et cetera. And virtual basically has all the advantages or most of the advantages of face-to-face. It's just you can do it at the convenience of both the interviewer and interviewee. So these pieces, the irony is we don't see this nearly as much as adjectives describing our interviews. So when I write a research grant and I'm doing the methods section, I'm like the first sentence in the methods section is I will describe, I plan to conduct X number of phone interviews with, or semi-structured interviews with, and those are my adjectives. And now in that one sentence, I can literally, and have my reviewers literally imagine, oh yeah, I know what that's like. And so you're using the adjectives to convey to your reviewers or your audience what you actually did. That's why adjectives become important here. Now, watch what happens when we apply adjectives to questions. They're not the same, right? Questions are either open-ended or closed-ended. They're either list or relational, or they're short, medium, and long. All right. Now, notice that we do not apply open or closed-ended interviews, those adjectives, to interviews. If you use it although I've actually done it myself, is say, yeah, I'm conducting an open-ended interview. No, an open-ended interview would basically not end. That's essentially what it would mean, right? So let's talk about open and closed and list and relational. So I think these are really important to understand of why you're asking questions. Oh, sorry. Where'd that go? Must be later. Okay, hang on. We'll talk about, let's talk about open-ended now. So open-ended basically are questions that allow people to fill in the blanks with things that you haven't thought about. And closed-ended, all it does is, closed-ended, you already have the response categories. And ideally, you will lay out the response categories such that each one is mutually exclusive, meaning that there's no overlap, and they're exhaustive, meaning that nothing that you come up with wouldn't fit into all the boxes. That's why in most closed-ended prompts, you always add or other. That makes them exhaustive, right? Now, we do that's closed-ended. We use closed-ended questions in surveys because we want to make sure everybody gets exactly the same question with exactly the same answer options. And then we can do real strict and very precise comparisons, right? Now, you use open-ended if you don't know what the dang answers are. Or you use open-ended if you want to understand the different ways people actually answer it and the words they use. Now, on the front end, in closed-ended surveys, you spend a ton of time making sure you got the right questions, the right wording, the right response categories. You do this thing called cognitive interviewing, where you test out every single question in your survey to make sure it's understandable. Everybody's sort of head bobbing and getting it and responding in the same ways, interpreting the question in the same ways. So you spend all your time on the front end in like surveys, and in interviews, you're going to use open-ended questions. You spend a lot less time on the front end worried about exactly the wording, and you spend all your time on the back end actually coding. So your trade-off is, where do you want to put your labor, front end or back end? And what do you need to know? Do you know the answers already and you're only looking for counts? Then go closed-ended. If you don't, then you need to go open, right? Now, The real problem with open-ended questions is you don't know what to do with or what I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, non-response. So let me give you a really foolish example. You're interviewing about driving on the right-hand side of the road, and 5 out of 10 people tell you, it mentions spontaneously driving on the right side of the road is part of the notion of the act of driving. 5 don't. How do you interpret the 5 that don't? If you go back to them, you find that one of them says, oh, I forgot, cultural assumption. Second one says that everybody, or sorry, I forgot, memory. So second one says everybody drives on the right-hand side, cultural assumption. Third one says they're from England, we drive on the other side of the road. Fourth one says they're from Vermont, we don't have sides of the road, not applicable. And the fifth one you can't find, missing. So when you don't see something in open-ended questions, it is difficult to interpret. Did they just forget? Is it common? And so forth. And then list and relational, all they are is, sometimes I want to know what's there, but often what I really want to know is, what is the relationship between two things? In those cases, you really want to ask questions and get stories, because those tell you relationships, not just the W questions. We'll talk about that in a second. So here are your interviews. We have unstructured interviews, which is essentially, or informal, come in 2 flavors. One is informal or hanging out. In this case, people really don't think of it as an interview. It's just a conversation, but you're collecting lots of information about your phenomena. It's super casual. I wouldn't want to do any comparisons by just having informal interviews. The other type of informal is what we call ethnographic interviews. And here, the person you're interviewing knows it's an interview, and it's very unstructured. You sort of meander around this general topic. This is what you would use in ethnography when you had somebody you can go back to multiple times. Semi-structured interviews are sort of structured, but that you structured the protocol, but the respondent has the control within that structured protocol, right? Includes a mix of techniques. So you're going to use sort of open-ended as well as closed-ended questions. You usually start off in these sort of things with grand tour questions. Just tell me generally what this is, what your feelings are about this or how this works. And you stay completely out of the way. You don't give any hints. And then you slowly work down to list and relational questions, and then compare and contrast. All right. At the end of the day, what I suggest doing on these semi-structured is you have a checklist of things that you want to see were covered. These are not questions. That the different topic, this subtopic, this particular area as actually mentioned. And if not, then you just go back and ask another question to elicit more from it. Okay. So these are ideal when you have both, your objective is both to learn and explore as well as compare, right? And it's probably the only way you really should be doing sort of exploratory work when you only have one shot at somebody. You want to be super strategic. Semi-structured interviews, ironically, are probably the most common elicitation task in all data collection, because we use them all the time, and they're the least talked about in the methodological literature, for what it's worth. The other type of semi-structured interviews are actually focus groups. Focus groups are following the same thing, but the difference here is you're not doing it with one individual person, but you're doing it with a group. And the big difference actually is in that focus groups is actually, focus is the adjective for groups here. And what you do in a focus group is you're getting the group to look at this one phenomena from different angles, and they're telling you about it. So you put the phenomena up in front of them, and you get all these people to tell you how they see it. All right. So it's not about making statements about the participants and how they see it, but it's about how the thing that you're looking at is seen. Right. And so you got to be really good at this, but semi-structures are great ways to get the range of perspectives relatively quickly. you get to, if you do this really right, as moderator, you throw a question out and they're doing all the talking in the group, and you listen to them. If it's done really well, they will shift into their own language and be communicating back and forth with language that you wouldn't use as an outside researcher. So if you're going to do focus groups with people who are using substances, you better really good at understanding that language. All right. It's also a great way to get at contentious issues because you get people going back and forth and see the argument structures. Disadvantage, focus groups are an N of 1. Okay. They're terrible at understanding variance within the group because you can't control the all of the group dynamics. There's no independence, so you really don't want to be counting anything. And if you really do want to make comparisons between groups, you should be doing separate focus groups for each group and at least 3 of them. Okay. There are workarounds. You can ask people open-ended questions beforehand and get that and collect that data and then use that as sort of a warm-up for the focus group. And then questionnaires and surveys, all questionnaires they're highly structured. Everybody gets the same set of questions. The questions just are open-ended. Okay. This makes it comparable across, very comparable. You're just going to have to do an analysis at the end where you're going to have to code all the responses, but you can count on this stuff. All right. And again, we've already talked about this. The relatively easy to set up the questions, far more labor and hassle to actually do the analysis. Surveys we've already talked about and sort of closed-ended questions, highly structured, easily comparable. You basically end up with a data set once you basically enter the data from the survey. Disadvantage, if you screw up, you're only going to learn what you already know, right? You figure out these are the questions you want to ask. Nothing new is going to come up other than those questions, right? And especially in the answer categories. If you've forgotten an answer category, it's going to appear in the other, and you're not going to be able to disentangle it very well. So other comparisons between the sort of interviews and focus groups are, interviews are really good for personal, private things. Anything that's stigmatizing or traumatizing, probably want to do an individual interview. If you just do some raw math, if you say, I'm going to do an interview with 10 people and it's going to be 90 minutes long, and you actually have all 90 minutes, you only have 9 minutes per person. That seems like a real big waste of time at the individual level to getting people. If you do the same 10 interviews for 45 minutes, you get a lot more information. But you lose the dynamics of the group, right? Focus groups, definitely good for shared consensual things, cultural things. And they're really good for actually testing interventions where you're looking to get as many eyeballs on the intervention to tell you all the things that might go wrong. And focus groups are everybody thinks focus groups are cheaper than interviews. Wrong. Super, super expensive because you have to get all the logistics of getting people there, getting them set up. And you often lose a lot of people that can't make that being in the same place at the same time. So those are your sort of options in terms of the interviewing. And here's the open-ended and closed-ended. We'll skip this because we've talked about it. And then a few more things. Questions also matter. So a lot of what we do is dependent upon how we ask the questions. There's a massive difference in people's responses for how questions. How does it work? How do you feel? How did it happen? Especially if you do a preamble and you set up that question, you'll get much longer responses. You'll get a lot of stuff that you haven't thought about. Those are different than what question, the W questions, which are basically what, where, when, who, and why. I will tell you, if you're going to use a why question to individuals, why did you do X? You're going to get a social justification, and it may not be what you're really looking for. So I tend to avoid why questions. I usually ask, so how did you come to that decision? And turn it into a how question and let them tell me about the process. You got quantity questions, how much, how many, how often. You got the dichotomous questions, is or does. And then you have this other thing is no question marks. Describe, walk me through, can you compare, can you explain? Those are all tasks. And it turns out when you ask people to perform a task as opposed to answer a question, they actually tell you more when they're performing the task. And I can't prove it, but I suspect what's really going on is in questions, there's an assumption that there's a right answer or a more socially correct response. And people are trying to figure out how to manage that. Whereas when you just ask them to actually perform a task, there's a lot less social pressure to come up with a right way of describing things, right? So look what happens when you ask them this way. So if we take the answers, if we treat the answers from broad answers to very narrow and specific, we go from left to right. For things on the far right tend to produce stories. Things in the middle, the W questions all produce lists. Quantity produce numbers, and yes, no. And your job is to figure out, what do I need? If you don't know anything, or if you are naive and you're in exploratory mode, you've got to be working on the left-hand side, moving towards the right. If you're in confirmatory mode, you want to be working from the right-hand side and maybe moving towards the left to get context. Right? Make sense? And you, trust me, just try switching up your questions when you're having a conversation with friends and see what happens if you ask how questions as opposed to W questions. All right, getting close. So what are these, the basically exploratory approach? So here's where I wanted to sort of, what's the difference between searching and exploring? So just take a minute and I want you to think about, what do you do when you misplace your car keys? Think about the last time you misplaced your car keys or anything else. What do you do? Okay. Then think about, what do you do if you go to a new museum you've never been to before? Or you go to a new city? And I'll bet there are different strategies. Okay. Then ask yourself, how do you know if you did a good job exploring this? Well, you know you're a good job of finding your keys if you find them, right? But how do you know you've done a good job of exploring that museum? And finally, what does this tell us about the effectiveness of exploration? So let's unpack a little the difference between searching and exploring. In searching, you actually have an objective. You're searching for something, and you're successful if you find it, right? The way you search is you set up a searching grid. So when people are missing on a mountain, the rescuers are literally will grid out the entire mountain and assign people to go through it. Super strategic. I bet when you're looking for your car keys, you try to retrace your steps and you start with this and this, and then you ask yourself, am I remembering correctly what I did? And then you expand that search out to other places that you didn't think were in the things, and ultimately usually find them in the place that you didn't expect. I found my keys in the freezer once. All right, so what I think it tells us about exploration is where you don't have a thing you're searching for. You don't know what you're searching for. That's when you're exploring. But what I'm going to argue is that exploration is really about you structure it to explore. All right. So good exploration is neither random nor overly specified. It's strategic. You have clear goals. You're setting up explicit steps to get there. And this structure is you're structuring to ensure that you don't miss anything. That's why you grid out that mountain search, right? You're laying out the phenomena in a structure and you're asking about it, but you're giving the person you're interviewing the opportunity to let you discover new things within that space. All right. And you're super adaptive if you follow the clues. Right. So exploration is systematic. Right. And in some ways, what you're really trying to balance is the semi with the structure in a sort of thoughtful way. So let's go back to our grid here of thinking about different aspects of data collection. All right, so we talked about already researcher control from the left to right. So I don't have very much control on that. So I want to be on the right-hand side of this mode if I'm really exploring. All right. I don't want to be too far over because I need to be able to explore. So if everything is totally structured, like in a survey, then that's not going to help me very much. So I got to be in this space here in the middle. But what I want to be is actually, I don't want to be, again, too precise at this questionnaire level because it doesn't allow me to find new things I haven't even thought about, nor do I want to be totally unstructured and just sort of meandering. So this actually turns out that semi-structured interview is actually the sweet spot. And it is the reason why most of our collection of data actually falls in this space. So advice is good exploration is like bird watching. When you're eliciting things in that sweet spot of semi-structured interview, your job is to set up the space for people to talk and get the hell out of the way. All right. You're taking up time every time you ask a question. All right. You guide them into this. Do not distract them with other questions. Ask more. Give me more about that. Tell me more about that. Huh, that's interesting. They tell you more. Right? So what you're doing here is you're being inefficient if you're asking too many questions and distracting. And you're also being biased because every time you talk, your respondent is thinking, this is how I need to respond to this. So you're entering into their space. And you also want to do these other things along the way. You're creating a space where people feel comfortable for answering. I look at transcripts and I expect to see at least 5 to 10 times more words from my interviewees than interviewers. If I don't get that, then you're really doing it wrong. Okay. So the last piece is going back to this big grid. We started off talking about data collection, but data collection is really a mix of these three pieces. This is the triangle. The exploratory approach actually combines data collection with the appropriate sample. Are you talking to the right people? Do they have the right eyeballs? And how are you going to analyze this? If you get this triangle right, that's your combination. That's your Legos that you're building. It really is this combination. So you don't want to separate off one set of techniques from another. They all blend together. Right? Take homes, simple. Use the right adjectives. Qual and quant for data. Exploratory, confirmatory for studies. Structured, unstructured for elicitation. Open, closed for questions. 2, got to be strategic. Build a framework. It's the framework that's really, I'm more and more convinced it's the framework that drives your success here. Then ask questions, more H questions, then W questions, then is or does questions. Get out of the way. Let people talk. Create the space for them to tell you more. Make them the experts and you the learner. Probe only for more detail when needed. And finally, you got to develop a really good design, and that's this combination of collecting and so forth. And it's got to tie back to what the heck you're trying to do to begin with. So, questions. I know it's long. I babble a lot.
Well, this was great, Gary. So many practical tips in there and also organizational structures and ways to think about this. But like you said, we only have a couple minutes, but if there are folks who have questions before 4:15, this is the time. And hopefully, Gary, we can distribute the slides to
Oh
folks.
yeah, I'll give you all the slides. But look, anybody that's got questions, I will talk to anybody on any project. Rick Meyer, not Rick Meyer. So just send me an email. The email's on the front. We'll set up a time. We'll have a conversation about how to do this. Always free to talk. Questions, anything in the chat, Christina? I'm looking. Any questions?
There are key questions because I'm a quantity person. So in quantity research, so having there is always new, statistical analysis technique evolves over time. You really have to catch up that kind of knowledge to apply more advanced, statistical analysis. How about quality research? Seems like, researchers' experiences, really matters rather than knowing about new technique and knowledge, how it works, how you training yourself as a, qualitative scholar. For quantity scholar, you have to really know about what is going on in the area, whether you can apply that knowledge. That matters a lot. So how that different from compared to quantitative research?
So people who tend to use quantitative, my observation is, like you say, the real emphasis is on the analysis, not on the collection of the data. Right. And so you just mentioned that, right? Is over time, I learned more and more analytic techniques to get at nuances. And almost always it's about causation. You're really looking at nuances of causation at, at the population level. So in the exploratory mode, what you're doing is two things. In exploration, you as the instrument are actually changing over time because you're getting smarter. And as you get smarter, you ask different types of questions. So the power of ethnography is twofold. It's both your access over long periods of time to lots of different people, but more importantly, as an ethnographer, when I go into that small little village in the middle of nowhere, often not speaking the language, I'm an idiot. I'm a complete moron of whatever I want to study. And during that time, I will guarantee you that some adult will walk up to you one day, more or less symbolically put their arm over your shoulder, pull you aside and say, let me explain how this works. And without saying it, it's because you're embarrassing yourself as an adult. Now we'll give you at that point, you're a professional third grader. And as you get smarter, you become a professional sixth grader and a professional high school, and you ask completely different questions. And if you do this enough, you actually become probably the expert, because the experts often don't talk to each other about the thing you're actually studying. So you have actually talked to them. So you actually know what the variation is at that level. So you see change on the data collection because you are seeing the phenomena differently. I think that's really, really powerful. And as you see the phenomena differently, you restructure how you ask these questions. So, I mean, I'm still doing the same thing with methods. I restructure every time I do a presentation. This is a completely different presentation, a lot of same slides, but I learn new things every time I do this, and I become a different instructor. And the same phenomenon, I think, is happening on the research side. Does that help? The flip side of that actually is on the analytics side, we're not all on the same page. Our analytics, and if you search on qualitative analysis, you will find this massive amounts of writing, of which it is filled with jargon. It's super parochial. The sociologists tend to look at it one way, the anthropologists another, the political science something else. They use different languages. They fight with each other. They're fighting with all the quantoids. Oh, it's a complete mess. So at least on the quantitative side, there is some sort of agreement. And maybe it's only because you have 10 digits you're working with at the very base of all your quantification.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary. And I think we're shifting gears to the round